Y pues me da muchísimo gusto, placer y honor de tener a Jason McLennan con nosotros, que ya sabemos todos que pues, fue el que inspiró el contenido del primer diplomado que realizamos de Diseño y Construcción Sostenibles, y que por un lado es pues un maridaje, digamos, ideológico entre lo que nos platicaba Jorge Tanovati, que está aquí presente también con nosotros. Muchas gracias, Jorge, por estar aquí, que fue el que nos recomendó usar este libro que ustedes ya conocen, y los que han hecho el diplomado en Diseño y Construcción Sostenibles han recibido fotocopias de este libro, ¿no? Es el libro de Jason McLennan, y aquí lo tenemos con nosotros. Pues me voy a permitir leer rápidamente una semblanza de él. Es miembro y fundador de Cascadia Green Building Council, Bioregional, director general de Cascadia, director general de Ecotone Publishing y miembro del comité de Bioregional América del Norte. Y su especialidad es el tema que nos va a brindar el día de hoy, que es el Living Building Challenge, que ya tendrá amplio tiempo para explicarles a ustedes de qué se trata, que en realidad es un sistema de certificación que va más allá del LEED. Ustedes ya han escuchado de qué se trata este sistema LEED. Lo saben aún los que nos visitan el día de hoy y que a lo mejor no han tomado los diplomados nuestros. De todas maneras ya seguramente conocen el contenido de esta certificación. Esta es otra y va más allá, ¿no? Pretende cosas mucho más retadoras que el LEED, ¿no? Jason es considerado uno de los mayores, las personas más influyentes en el movimiento verde y fundador del movimiento verde en Estados Unidos. Él trabajó con varios proyectos importantes en su país. Él es originalmente de Canadá. Incluyen proyectos que han sido certificados LEED Platino, Oro, y proyectos con energía cero. Director general de Cascadia, organiza trabajo en el área de edificios verdes y desempeño sostenible. Esta empresa es un capítulo importante del US Green Building Council y del Canadian Green Building Council. Es fundador y responsable de Ecotone Publishing, única editora dedicada a edificios verdes en América del Norte. Se ha publicado su trabajo en varios periódicos, revistas y libros. Es autor de 4 libros, entre los cuales les acabo de enseñar el que nos ha inspirado, y otros más. Thank you, Jason, for being with us today. We're very proud to have you as a keynote speaker today, and I know you're going to conduct the workshop tomorrow. Well, it's something that we wanted to do for some time, and you know that, and I'm very glad that you can be with us today. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's really wonderful to be here with you all. This is my first time in Mexico City. It's my first time in Mexico. And I've had incredible hosts and wonderful, people have been showing me around, and I really love your city. It's a fantastic place, and today we toured Barragán's houses, and yesterday the Museum of Anthropology, and it's a beautiful, beautiful place. So thank you so much for having me. It really is great to be here. There's a lot that I want to talk with you about tonight. I have some stories to tell you, and some analysis, and then I'm going to talk about the Living Building Challenge quite a bit, which is a very stringent program that is getting a lot of attention around the US, around Canada, and increasingly in other places. And I'm hoping that we'll have some good dialogue, some good discussion, and we'll learn a little bit more about each other. I'm a little bit short of breath. I've noticed I live at sea level, and it's a little bit of a shock to my system, so I'm a little bit, more like that than I normally am, so please forgive me if I'm not as smooth as I would like to be. But I do have nice spinning graphics for I'm here in many ways representing two organizations. The first organization is the International Living Building Institute. It's a fairly new organization, founded earlier this year. And because of all the interest in the Living Building Challenge from many other countries, we started this organization in order to figure out how we can spread this idea, this program to many different places. And I would love at the end of the discussion to ask you all how you think perhaps we could bring these ideas here in Mexico and really promote the Living Building Challenge. And I need your collective advice and wisdom on how to do that. So what we're trying to do is really encourage a much more profound, transformative level of environmental performance in the built environment, anywhere that we can, frankly. The other organization that I represent, I'm the CEO of the Cascadia Region Green Building Council. And it is a unique organization in that it crosses into two countries, both Canada and the United States. So we're cross-border, and we cross multiple states within the United States. And the reason why we do that is that we believe we have more in common than we have differences. And in the two countries in this region, because we share, in this part of North America, we share a similar climate, a similar type of building construction, that kind of thing. And it's been a wonderful way to bring Canadians and Americans together to learn about green building and green systems. And you see here this fish. This is the salmon, and it's our symbol. And we like to say that we promote green building in all the land where the salmon run. And we actually go much beyond those borders, but that really was the symbol for what we do. And more with the Living Building Challenge, we're sending these ideas to many, many places. And it's very exciting. So we have the website there if you haven't had a chance to look at it. Now, I thought I would start today with a few stories about some cities that a couple of them you probably don't know very much about, I'm guessing. One of them, Portland, you may know a little bit about. How many here have been to Portland, Oregon? We have a few. How many have been to Kansas City? Huh? Yeah? A couple, that's good. Oh, good. More than I thought. How about to Sudbury? Anyone been to Sudbury? I would have been very shocked. But I've been to Sudbury. That's my hometown in Canada. So what I wanted to do is, these are three places that I've lived, and wanted to talk about some lessons from these communities in terms of environmental impact, in terms of some of the major planning moves that were made or not made, as the case may be, in each of these communities. And more as a reminder for me, where I am now is the dot on the bottom there. So very far away, and much closer to the sea where I live now. I actually live in the Seattle area right now. So I'm going to start, and this is in some way a bit more of an introduction about where I come from and what motivates me as an architect and designer. We all are products in many ways of where we're from, right? The cities, the communities where we grow up shape us in very powerful ways that often we don't fully appreciate until we live somewhere else, till we travel, until we see other cultures, until we do different things. And I'm a Canadian. I have a green card. I live in the States, and my family are American. But I'm very much Canadian. I grew up playing hockey. And we were talking about this over lunch. When I was a little boy, I had skates on at 5 years old, and was skating around the rink, and it's really cold where I'm from. A few of you have been to Calgary. Have any of you been to northern Canada here? Any northern? Yeah, where did you go?
Okay. Well, it's too cold. Okay.
A very new place for my family.
Ah.
Yeah,
there was too much excitement. So we have, how many live in Calgary here? So you have Calgary, we have a few Calgary. So Calgary, okay, when you were there in the winter, you were crazy to go in the winter. So very similar kind of cold where I grew up. And this is a historic photo of the downtown core of Sudbury. Not a huge city, about 160,000 people. It's a mining community. If you did happen to read my book, I talk a little bit about it at the beginning of my book. But Sudbury is a very interesting place from a variety of reasons that I wanted to talk to you about. And the streetcars are no more. Most of the public transportation are no more. But I'm going to tell you a few interesting things about this place. So if you go back, and it's important for us as we believe in ecology and sustainable design to understand the deep history of the places that we're from. Before people messed them up, what were they like? And if you go back a long time, millions of years in this part of the world, and you were unlucky enough to be standing there, you would have looked up and saw the second largest meteorite to ever hit the planet Earth come cascading down and slam into this place. So it was the second largest meteorite that had ever hit the world, and it slammed into my region. And you see this round lake that's there. Does anyone have a laser pointer by chance? It just occurred to me that because I'm going to point sometimes to things that okay, so you see this lake? So this is a very deep lake, and it was part that the meteorite broke into two pieces. And the first piece slammed and went very deep in this area here, and then the second part, the bigger part, crashed in over here. And what you can see, and this outline, is the impact zone, and this is quite a lot of miles. I believe this lake here is about 12 miles long. So this was a big impact. So it may have started the demise of the dinosaurs. This is how serious this impact was. And it's interesting, this soil, there's a geologic area known as the Canadian Shield, that for much of the history of Canada was under a lot of ice. And as the glaciers, retreated and came forth, they scraped off all the soil, very poor soils in this part of Canada, except for the valley of this area. There's a very rich pocket of soil for some interesting reason in the middle. And these are low hills, very old hills that have been eroded down over a millennium. And what happened was that this impact left a very, very rich vein of a lot of different metals. In particular, nickel is found more in this spot than anywhere in the planet, in this one spot. So this is the deep history of where I was from. And so originally, this community was a rail town. It was kind of a hub of different rail lines, and then they, so it was tiny town, and then they discovered first copper there, and then they discovered nickel, and so there was a big boom. There was a big rush to, create a town there to get all this metal out of the city, and this town started to creep up. And what I want to share with you was how this is, in the downtown core. This is during the 50s, 40s and 50s. And what you're not seeing is the landscape beyond. So the downtown is in this region here, okay? There's a whole bunch of lakes there, and the downtown kind of nestles amongst all those lakes. So, now, if you go back to about 500 years ago, what you'd find are giant towering pine trees and maples and huge trees. This is what was left after the first 50 to 80 years of mining in this whole region. So this was a pristine wilderness, and Canada has a lot of wilderness, but this was an area that had a lot of moose, beaver, deer, bears, everything that you think of when you think of the Canadian wilderness. And what they basically did, because back in that time, in order to get the nickel out of the rock, they had to have these giant open pit fires. So they cut down all the trees, and they didn't care so much about the trees. So they cut everything down, and they created these giant fires, huge, they would burn night and day, days and days on end, and they would pile the rock, and it's called smelting, pulling the ore out of the rock, and it created this incredible air pollution that would descend in this whole area, and it acidified all the lakes, killed off all the fish, it stained all the rock. All this rock was gray rock, it stained all the rock dark black permanently, and anything that was still alive died. Everything died because it was so acidic. There was so much sulfur, and you can imagine what it did to people's lungs. They breathed in this air, and imagine the workers that lived there. And so this is just a quick shot. This is the color of the rock. This is a cut, and this is the color of the rock. So it's literally changed. And this is very special rock, as I mentioned. It's unique on the planet. So there's this meteorite, and there's all this nickel. There's no place on the planet exactly like this place. And they greatly damaged it. This is one of the mine shafts in the area. And this is what you see when you basically look out the window anywhere in my hometown. This is, it's, I believe, maybe been surpassed now in Russia, but this was the world's tallest smokestack. And it looks like when you're behind one of the hills and you can't see the complex, it looks like a big cigarette. And it's like a giant is lying down, puffing. And when I was a little boy, I thought that this was how we made clouds. And I said to my mother, this is a cloud-making machine. And she was not very pleased with my analysis. No, honey, it's not, in fact, a cloud-making machine. And I thought it actually made better clouds than the clouds above because they were puffier and they looked really clean, but they were not clean. And just to give you a sense, I mean, it's hard to get a sense of scale. This is a huge, gigantic operation. And what you'll see another smokestack here, and there's one in the foreground. Did you see it there? And they're also giant. These are giant, right? So this one is probably as tall as many of the tallest buildings here. This one here. And the reason that they built this smelter is because they had to stop this air pollution where these open pit, right? They had to internalize it, and they had to send the pollution up higher. And it was part of this philosophy that happened around World War II and beyond, where the solution to pollution is dilution. It rhymes, very clever. And so the idea was, as long as you send it somewhere else, it doesn't exist anymore. We can pretend that this doesn't exist. And so they built this first smokestack, and fortunately what happened is the pollution went up and it just went a little further and came down and killed lakes a little further along. And then so they built this next one, which was taller and went a little further still. And so they got very smart. They said, what we need to do is build a smokestack so high that we send all of our pollution to the Yanks, to the Americans. That's what we need to do. And everyone thought that was a brilliant idea. And so they built it. This was if you're an architect or an engineer, this was a continuous pour. They poured this thing continuously, day and night, and didn't stop in this movable slip form. It's taller than the Eiffel Tower. You can get about 18 school buses inside the base of this thing. It's so darn big. This will give you the sense. This was the World Trade Tower. This is the Empire State Building. And there's the Sudbury Superstack. This is huge. So here's it's behind this hill is the giant smoking. So everywhere you go, this was in my psychology. We're talking about psychology today. It affects you, because everywhere you go, you see this thing towering over the landscape. A reminder that the humans are in charge, right? That we have the power. That's and it's big.
And does it used to be for the extraction of nickel?
It does.
The nickel and copper?
Yeah, mostly nickel. Copper is kind of a bonus when they get it. The nickel is the main output. At one point, I believe during World War II, 90% of the world's nickel came from this place. I believe now it's anywhere in the realm of 25 to 30% of the world's nickel. So anytime you use stainless steel, anything that has nickel in it, and almost there's so many things that are nickel, it likely came from my hometown. This is some of the results. Rivers that run red, huge pollution, the rocks that were stripped of all life. In the late 60s, when NASA was planning, when Kennedy said we're going to go to the moon, they sent astronauts to my hometown dressed in all their suits because it looked more like the moon than any place they could get. And there's this great footage of these astronauts jumping around in the rocks while all these people from my hometown are looking at them like they're crazy. But this is the landscape that I grew up in. It affects you when you see this. When I was a little boy, and I don't tell this story that often, I swam in the wrong lake and I lost all my hearing in my left ear. I'm deaf. And I almost lost hearing in my right ear because it was so polluted and some stuff got in my ear and ate away the inside of my ear, and I had to be rushed to the hospital, and it was very traumatic. So it affects you when this is what you grew up with. Now, there is a good part to this story, and the good part had to do with the citizens of my hometown saying, this is crazy, we can't live in this kind of environment any longer. The whole community put pressure first on the industry to clean up their act. They started installing more pollution control measures, scrubbers in the stack. It was successful in sending pollution to the northeastern United States and helped to kill off many of the forests in the northeastern United States, but it did stop a lot of the pollution locally. So now there was much less pollution. So there was a chance now to regenerate, to restore. And so what happened was a whole bunch of people, the government got involved, the local university, the local school systems, everybody, the mining companies, and they began to plant trees. And originally the trees all died because the soil was so acidic that nothing would grow there. So they got smart and they realized that they had to change the pH, the acidity of the soil to make it more base, right? And then after that, so a lot of us, myself included, as a schoolboy, I dragged bags of lime on my shoulders up the hills, and all my classmates did, and we spread this lime on the soil, and then we planted trees. And it was a very powerful lesson to us, right, as little kids, that we were healing our place, our community, ourselves. We weren't just watching the workers as we drove by. Ourselves, we were all enlisted, the whole community. And we saw these trees, and the hills around my house, I used to love running around on the rocks and stuff, and these trees that my friends and I planted, they would be growing up alongside me. And things grow very slow in the north. It was a short growing season. But the trees would, next year they were a little higher, and you started to see less and less of this barren rock and more of these trees. And it started these hills that were just barren. So I showed you a similar hill that was completely just nothing. And this was about 20 years later, where a lot of the trees were growing back. And it won a United Nations commendation as one of the most powerful regreening efforts in the world. And Sudbury began to transform itself. And the lakes started to heal themselves. And biologists began working on healing the water in this place and bringing the fish back. And the city began to, in many ways, rediscover the water. This water is everywhere. Again, because of that glacial movement, right? They left so many places and all the water, right? So there's water everywhere. And it can be very beautiful. This is a Canadian magazine. And actually, in the late 90s, was actually voted one of the best cities in Canada to grow up in. And when I was a smaller boy, and I told people where I was from, they'd be like, "Oh, I'm sorry," and they would be ashamed on behalf of me that I had to live in such a place. And then it was voted one of the best places to grow up, and it started to transform itself. And this is a more recent photo in many parts. This is beautiful Lake Ramsey. This is the new science center. The government made the mining companies buy a big new science center for their community, amongst many other things. And this is part of the region now, right? This is very different. It's still not pristine. It's still not like it was 500 years ago. The trees are not towering, 100 feet above you, but they're at 30 feet, right? They're going to get there. And it's a much healthier place to be. This is the University, Laurentian University, a beautiful place. They have their own lake on this part. And this is not a little pond, this is a big lake. This is 12 miles long from this point, from one side to the other. And you can see that it's really green. And it was a very powerful message to me growing up that when our species, when we want something from the earth, we have incredible power to destroy it. We can be very thoughtless about how we take these resources, and when we think like that, when we're that ignorant, we can just devastate the landscape. But when we figure it out, when we realize that there are better ways, and we get the community involved, we can have a tremendous healing power as a species. We can transform, regenerate, right, the landscape in powerful ways. And that was, for me, that was, one of the singular moments of my life that I realized that this is what I needed to be about, was finding a way to take the most degraded opportunities and think about the highest potential, the best, place that we can imagine from it. And, it had everything to do with this lesson in suffering. So, I became an environmentalist from quite an early age. I decided to become an architect when I noticed another disturbing trend in my hometown that has to do with city planning. Right? And I know this is a community planning, city scale, of course. A mining town, and you probably, I don't know if any of you are from mining communities, as the price of metal goes up and down, development goes up and down, people come in and come out. And there was a boom in the early 80s where nickel got very expensive, and therefore, the mining companies worked extra hard and hired a lot of people. A lot of people were moving into the community. And so development. And this was a time when a lot of American companies that Costco, Home Depot, Walmart, this is the time when they really started to think about, we're going to go global. We're going to be in every country around the world. And so, of course, Canada was a very easy place for them to come to. And so my hometown received the benefit of these companies that decided, well, there's all this money flowing into this town, we're going to pick Sudbury as one of our next expansion hubs. So they came and they built these kinds of architecture, you're familiar with it. The first thing they did was they cut down our trees. Literally, the trees I planted in one development. Then they scraped off all the soil from the bags of lime that we carried on our backs. They took that. And then they took this rock that was unique on the planet, and they blasted it to make it flat. to make it nothing special, to make it like anywhere in the world, right? And then they put this crap on it to sell us stuff that we didn't need, right? And this is what they built on my hill. And I decided that I was going to be an architect. And I was going to fight this kind of thinking, you know? So this is why I'm here. This is why I wrote that book. And it's why I wrote the Living Building Challenge. And I'd like you, as you think about this, to think about, you know, your city, your neighborhood, your hometown. Because my thinking, Sudbury is just a metaphor for many of the places where you all grew up too. The places that you remember being special, right? Or it's places that you visited that were special, and how in our haste to get something that we wanted in the now, something very, very, in this very shallow time frame, what we were willing to destroy forever, or for quite a long time. Think about that as we go through. And some lessons from my city is you cannot, right, ignore the uniqueness of the place. You have to respect. Nobody thought about the deep history, right? Walmart, when they came in, didn't think about the deep history. They didn't ask those questions. They wanted to maximize profit. And without a healthy environment, you're nothing but with political will. Right? So, I'm going to skip quite far, and it's easy to get passionate about my hometown. I've lived in a lot of different places, and surprisingly, for 10 years I ended up in the Midwest of the United States. The reason I ended up in Missouri is that there was a very famous architect that happened to be from Kansas City that I greatly admired. His name is Bob Berkebile. And I know that you know Bob Berkebile. I don't know if any of you know Bob Berkebile, and you know Bob Berkebile. Bob Berkebile in the United States is kind of one of the founders of the green building movement. Some people call him the Yoda of the green building movement, or if you're into Harry Potter, the Professor Dumbledore of the green building movement. Very sweet man, a brilliant man, and I came to Kansas City to train with Bob and to be, his right-hand person, and worked with him. Eventually, he made me his partner, and I was practicing alongside Bob. It was a wonderful experience. And I moved to Kansas City sight unseen. I had never been to the city when I took this job. I had never been to that part of the United States. I had no interest. I had interest in the West Coast and the East Coast, where all the action is. And the Midwest, I didn't think I would ever live there. I thought when I was hired that I'd be there 2 years. I'd learn everything I could from this guy in 2 years, and I would go. But I stayed there 10 years. And Kansas City is instructive from a city planning, sustainability perspective for a whole different set of reasons than Sudbury was. And Sudbury's lessons are very primal, right? They're about extraction and building things, right? And Kansas City's was all about the automobile and scale and transportation. A very different set of rules. And in some ways, Kansas City is a metaphor for many American cities, but a lot of places in Mexico, I think, as well, where the automobile has kind of taken over. Not that you have that problem in Mexico City. And but Kansas City is in many ways kind of the average American city. And it's interesting, but it has in its earlier history, I'm not going to go into the deep history of Kansas City, but in its earlier planning history, it made some really wonderful moves around public transportation, had a really wonderful streetcar public transportation grid, where it did begin to incorporate automobiles. It had developed really beautiful boulevards with fountains. It became known as the city of fountains. They like to brag that they have more fountains than Rome. I remind them that their fountains are nowhere near as nice as any of the fountains in Rome. but they do have many of them. And they developed a lot of these wonderful mixed-use neighborhoods. And you guys know the New Urbanist movement. Well, you could go to Kansas City and see what they based the New Urbanist movement on in many cases. It had the first planned shopping development in the United States in terms of this idea of, from the beginning, one developer buying a large tract of land and building basically a whole village that was based around shopping, all owned by one family. It was the first in the United States to do that. And this neighborhood is one where I lived for a long time, and it was one of the first streetcar suburbs where they built these nodes around these lines, right? So all the stuff that talked about in New Urbanism. So Kansas City had this great legacy, and in many ways it squandered it. It threw it away. And you know, it had great institutions. It still does. In fact, they just built a new addition to this museum, the Nelson Museum, where Stephen Hall built this incredible new addition to it. It's a beautiful art museum. But they have these sort of real gems in Kansas City people don't realize, a real thriving art culture. The second largest train station in the United States, Union Station. If you're a fan of old mafia movies like Al Capone, well, Al Capone's gang shot up the front of this train station, taking out a whole bunch of people, and the bullet holes are still in the building. And this on the right is that shopping development I mentioned, and the architect based it off of Seville, Spain. And the tower there is a 7/8 replica of the Seville Tower. Isn't that interesting? In Kansas City, Missouri, 7/8 replica. Why 7/8? I don't know. And there's a problem. But this is called the Plaza in Kansas City. It's still the most successful development in the city done in pre-war. And Kansas City is famous for a lot of things: barbecue, jazz, blues, all these things. But what happened with the city is it fell in love, as most American cities did, with the automobile. The idea of getting everyone having a car and being able to drive anywhere you want. And it began to interject the automobile into everything. And so the downtown core, and this is a photograph from the 90s, showing what happened in the 50s and 60s, is they built all these interstate freeways, which happened in every city around the U.S. And they basically blasted away whole neighborhoods. And they created these rifts between the fabric of the city and created these, these are significant freeway systems. And the idea was, of course, well, we want to get as many cars as efficiently as possible into the downtown core. It actually killed the downtown core. It had the opposite effect of what they thought. And what it also did is it killed a bunch of these neighborhoods. This neighborhood over here, it's taken 30 years for it to recover because it was now an island separated in terms of there was a canyon on one side. Because of this, there was no fabric. There's like one little bridge now that it just died. And much of the city had these problems. And it began to sprawl. And sprawl and sprawl and sprawl. And a lot of the public spaces, they began to lose all their people. And in around 4:30 to 5 o'clock, there's no one left in the city. And people were moving further and further and further and further up. Now, I know flying over Mexico City, this is a huge, huge city. And you have 20 million people. So this city is not quite as large in area, but it's getting close for 1.6 million. So it's huge with nobody there. So everyone has these giant lawns in the front, in the back. Everybody, it doesn't matter how much money you have. Everyone has these giant lawns, and these, because the Midwest, you can just sprawl and sprawl. And so then during the 60s and 70s, they started to make a bunch of planning decisions that really started to the expression, drive a nail in the coffin. They had to have a new airport. Well, they bought land way miles and miles and miles outside the city because it was cheap. And so now everyone had to drive like an hour to get to the airport. And they did this for the air, the city is way, and they did this with over and over again. So then they were building a new stadium. Well, they built it on the edge of town. They built a baseball stadium and baseball stadium, football stadium is the sea of cars because there's no way to get there because it's so at the edge of town. So the only way to get there is by trucking. So they started stripping the city of its life, all in the name of the automobile. And again, this is the story of so many American cities that we've seen. And this beautiful, they almost tore this building down for 20 years. There was a big fight, tear it down. They were going to, it's an incredible building. Eventually they saved it, and it's now a science museum that our firm and many others in Kansas City worked on. But they were going to destroy it because there was no business in the downtown. And, so they just, now Missouri and this part of the country is a great agricultural region. So what's the best thing you can do in an agricultural region is to put pavement over it. The best thing you can do for prime farmland is to build a freeway interchange or put trash or, it's crazy, right? But this is what Kansas City and many other places did. And this community sprawled and sprawls and sprawls. But only 1.6 million. Right? So very, very different than Mexico City, but similar, kind of expansion. I don't know if you know the discoverers Lewis and Clark. The word discover is such a wrong word for what they did, since there was people all over. But they had an expedition, right? And they came to this place where Kansas City was later founded, and there were parakeets everywhere. Carolina parakeet. There's not parakeets anymore in the United States. They were killed off. They're extinct. But they remarked at how bountiful this region was, and filled with parakeets everywhere, right? And now, if you go there, it's very different. There's no parakeets. And this is a pattern of development, very common, in the United States. You probably know the term leapfrog development, right? Well, we'll do that. Oh, we'll just buy this next lot. Oh, we'll just buy this next lot. And they leave these patches that are now useless as farmland. They're useless as habitat. They're useless for anything. Nobody can. This is not a park. Nobody enjoys it. There's nothing. It's just been left over because someone's moved on to the next piece. Because they have taken so much land, so little density. Right? And this goes on for miles in all directions. Miles and miles. This is kind of depressing, eh? Miles and miles. Now again, so you might have this whole area here, and there might be, this is not a residential zone, so there might be no one that lives in this whole area. Right? Or you have this development where everyone has these giant lots. So this is kind of an interesting graph where the dots represent development occurring during the decade. Now the heart of the city is right in here. So this is just around the 40s, 1940s, where most of the development. The other thing that I'll mention is, see this line here? It goes down. This is a state line. So one half of the city is in Missouri and one half is in Kansas. And I know you don't have any of these problems in Mexico City, but you have different police forces, you have different bureaucracies, you have different infrastructure. I used to live on State Line, and on that side of the street, 15 feet away, was different rules, and on my side of the street was different rules. And so, but a lot of people began moving across the state. They never paid any taxes to support the development where most of the public infrastructure was, and they just moved, and it's interesting. So, right?
We have that in Mexico City.
I know you do.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes, I'm sorry. I was being very sarcastic. Yes, because things like buses, right? They stop, and then you got to get on a different bus system. So it screws everything up. And here you see 1950s, 1960s. Notice what's happening, right? 1970s. So what's happening during this time is between the 60s in the United States, everyone owns a car. Everyone, right? In America, everyone owns a car. By the 70s, everyone owns 2 cars. By the 80s, everyone owns 3 cars. And, right? And the city, in its history, is left, look at the 90s. This is really scary. Right. So the city is rotting. And this is where those great museums, those great boulevards, this is where 100 years of investment. And it's being abandoned. Now again, what's happening, this is politics at play. So this is Johnson County. So this became a wealthier enclave. Notice on this side of state line. The county over here lowered the taxes, lowered everything, built newer schools, attracted all the wealth out of the city, and some of the worst cities in the United States, worst schools in the United States are in Kansas City, Missouri, because they lost all their tax revenue. And so then it creates this cycle where it gets worse and worse in this part of the community, and it gets better and better out here. And they don't have to contribute a dime, but they still benefit. They still go to the football game, they still go to the things, but they don't have to pay anything. And it creates, it's like sucks the money and life out of the community. It's very interesting. It's starting to reverse itself now in Kansas City. But what it meant, when I looked out on parts of downtown in Kansas City, it felt there was so much, this isn't even the best slide, but there were so many parking lots because a lot of buildings were torn down because they were abandoned, falling apart, that it looked like Berlin after World War II. And right, just sea of cars and parking, and public transportation, forget about it. There's no subway. There's a bus system, but not a very good one. Not because the bus utility wasn't trying, but it was almost impossible. Right? And so it's one of in terms of the amount of vehicle miles traveled per person per year, one of the highest in the United States. Houston beats it. Maybe that may be it. So it's a really interesting series of lessons. Now here's a city that got started down the right path, in my opinion, in terms of building the kind of infrastructure that makes a city healthy. And then when the new fad came along, when the car came along, it abandoned 100 years of planning and 100 years of, in many ways, success, and threw it away, and it really suffered because of it. And there, fundamental principles: when cars rule, people lose. That's just the basic rule. When cars rule, people lose. And this other idea, without limits, everyone is limited. As long as they can keep leapfrogging, keep expanding further and further afield with no consequences. It was, in fact, rewarded. And the city would still build infrastructure, right? Because the taxpayers, the citizens would demand that they build sewers and roads. So the city would be stuck with miles and miles and miles of infrastructure they had no budget to repair. So the roads are bad. And, and we talked a bit about this, it's mind-boggling to me as a Canadian. There's so much wealth in the United States. And at the same time, they totally misunderstand and miss opportunities to have much better cities because of how they handle their decisions. And so here's a city that does, in fact, have a lot of wealth, and they have potholes all over many of the roads, and they have whole sections of the town that that they shouldn't have with that much wealth in the community, but they just ignore, right? And so this notion of sprawl filling the community was a very powerful lesson. Is this interesting? Is this, yeah? So what I find interesting is, again, this idea that Kansas City is just a metaphor for so many communities around the world, but in particular in the United States, because in so many countries follow the lead, but they're following a model. The Americans have picked the wrong models, and they're just waking up to it now that they've made some grave errors of judgment, in my opinion. And now many countries are following the errors, right, of the United States. Over a 30 to 40 year period, this is remarkable. Over a 30 to 40 year period, every city, every town, every village in the United States was fundamentally changed to be a community that operated around the scale of the person, the individual, and we ballooned ourselves into these 2,000 pound, 4,000 pound monsters of steel that 20 feet by 6.5 feet or whatever the dimensions, and we built our cities around the construct of automobiles, right? And so we lost the fabric that created the healthy community that America was actually built on. The things that made the United States as powerful, as great as it has become, they've actually started to erode through their planning decisions, through their decisions about infrastructure, and they've lost so much of the heart and soul in many communities as they've moved from this to this and from this to this. And they without trying, without other than the freeways, which was a grand plan by the U.S. military to make sure that they could mobilize tanks and troops around the country very quick. Other than that, there was no grand plan that suggested that every city would do this. It happened organically in 30 to 40 years. And that's important because later we're going to talk about how we have in the next 20 to 30 years only, we have to completely transform our communities again, hopefully with a plan. We've done it before. Right? And so if we've done it in the past, then it's possible to do now. And there's a lot of times when Cascadia Living Building Challenge, we talk about very big steps, very significant steps forward. People have a hard time imagining how could we move so fast. But change always seems slow when you're in the midst of the change. But if you look back historically, especially again, interesting lesson. Here in the United States, they changed every community in 30 to 40 years without a plan. And they're different cities, right? But I'm going to tell you about one city now that I think got on a better track than most American cities, that figured out some of these lessons and made some changes, and certainly is not a perfect city. But is probably, in my opinion, the best planned city in the United States and the best functioning city in the United States. Again, not perfect, but really a wonderful city. And the city of bridges, some call it City of Roses. They have incredible rose gardens. So this is closer. This is in my region now, and we have an office in downtown Portland. Let's look at Portland's history a little bit. So Portland, in a similar way but a different industry, was like Sudbury. It was an extractive economy. It was an economy based on harvesting stuff from nature and turning it into useful goods. In this case, it was about timber. It was about wood. And the forests of Oregon are incredible. I mean, the Oregon, Washington, British Columbia, the trees are just amazing, right? They're huge. And so this was the lumber mecca. And so it really helped build this economy. But it was very much a working class, industrial city in the United States. And in the beginning, just like with, as we move towards, post-war, the 1950s, just like every other city in America, it was essentially given a mandate to build this interstate freeway system. And so without much care, they blasted the neighborhoods and historic areas, and they put in this network of automobile-based development and started down the same path that Kansas City started down, but it didn't even have the rich architectural history that Kansas City had and some of the more eastern communities had. because it was a newer city. And they started down that path, and a variety of things started to happen that I think started to drift them back in the right direction, even though they have a lot of room to grow. Now, I showed this image, and tomorrow some of you are going to be working with me in this workshop where we're going to focus on one district of Portland. There's some exciting things going on. We're not going to talk about that so much tonight, except for a discussion about the Living Building Challenge, but I wanted to show this image, which I'll show tomorrow. Basically, what the freeways, it kind of looks like a diagram. We see the freeway that comes here, yeah? And then there's a freeway that comes here. And there was a freeway, this is very important, that came here too. So basically, the freeways cut all the citizens away from the river, right? And that's what Kansas City did too. You literally can't really get to the river in Kansas City. It's a shame. You have this river there and you can't even get to it. And so the car got to the river, but the people didn't. You can't walk to the, right? And so there was this freeway system. What Portland did, what San Francisco did, but very few other cities did, is they removed the freeway. That's, in most places, that was like, remove the freeway. Are you crazy? And Seattle is going through this struggle right now, and there's all this intense politics with the citizens about what do we do, and what about traffic, and how can we do this. In San Francisco, they removed, at the Embarcadero, they removed the freeway and gave it back, became an amenity, and now, the real estate values there are rising. And in Portland as well, they removed the freeway and they built a park. Right? And I'm going to show you a couple pictures. And so they started to heal this connection to the natural systems at the edge of the city. And then they started to make investments not in the automobile, but in public infrastructure. And they started building a really sophisticated light rail system, streetcar system that goes throughout the city, and it's free. So anyone in the city can get on, get off. It's clean, it runs beautifully, and everyone uses it. And they started to, in some cases, shrink the section of the city, bring the sidewalks bigger, make less room for the cars, punish the cars. Very, very different attitude than Kansas City and most American communities. And again, they removed the freeway and replanted along the edge and created a public park. And this idea we're going to talk about with the Living Building Challenge, that especially in cities, where we are surrounded with so much concrete, so much sterile environments, how essential it is to our human nature to be able to reconnect, especially with water. And there's so many cities where you don't know that there used to be a stream under your feet, we've covered it, or there used to be a river, right, and we've destroyed it. And that is a huge area. And so Portland said, no, we're going to reconnect our citizens, and everyone, regardless of economic class or the background or anything, everyone is free to use this place. And they kept investing in good infrastructure. They just built a new, I think it's a Swiss gondolier system up the mountain to connect the neighborhood up in the mountain down to below, and it's becoming a tourist attraction. So they're investing in alternative transportation. They have a really great, this is called the park walks. They maintained through many cities in the United States. A lot of parks just went away for development. They maintained a huge section of what they call the park blocks. Portland also benefited, by the way, from very small blocks, 200 by 200. So it's very good for walking scale because you always have an intersection coming up soon. So as a pedestrian, you have many more opportunities to travel around the city and that kind of thing. And they invested in street furniture and infrastructure for people. So a lot of benches, flowers, a lot of better pavements, emphasizing I noticed that the pedestrian isn't exactly in the highest stature on Mexico City streets. But in Portland, the moment you see a person start to walk, the cars stop. And please. and it really, the pedestrians rule, and that means bikes rule, right? And I noticed also that this is not the greatest place to bike. And it isn't in Kansas City either. But in Portland, people bike everywhere, right? And it's wonderful to see people, get healthier, more fit. And it's hip, it's cool. It's cool to leave your car. It's not cool to bring your car everywhere. That's very different. The culture in this part changes. The values change to the reality, right? And it's very different. And great, public spaces are there. It's a wonderful city. They made some smart moves. They also benefited the state of Oregon, and actually Washington as well, has an urban growth boundary. It's not perfect, but basically it does serve to limit sprawl so that you can't do this kind of leapfrog development everywhere. And originally that was set up to protect industry, protect timber and farm land, etc. It's not perfect, but it really helped to emphasize for developers that they should build more dense and more mixed-use communities. Portland is not dead after 5 o'clock like Kansas City is. In a minute I want us to take a brief break, but I want to first talk about a few more things. And these are ideas that I found this image on the internet. It's an incredible image. If you think about this paradigm of how we've been building our cities and how we've been designing our buildings, in fact, how we make everything, we have had a construct, a sort of a mental model that has put technology as the sort of highest result of our efforts, right? Technology has become an end unto itself rather than merely a tool to help us. We sort of worship technology in very unhealthy ways. And perhaps more disturbing to me is this idea that the machine has become the metaphor for everything. So, and I love the Villa Savoye, but I don't love the metaphor of a machine for living in. I actually don't think that house, it fits that metaphor. It's an incredible house to be in. It's a house of life, but the metaphor is a sign of the times. We began to describe the human body as a clock, as a machine, and figuring out how we work as a machine, and we began to define. So if you look at the different elements of society, we often use a mechanical way of describing how something works instead of a biological way, right? And it's something that I find very interesting, maybe you do as well, is taking a look at visions of the future, different futurists or architects, as the case may be, about what they think the future should look like and where our cities should head in the future. These, of course, are the three famous ones: Bucky Fuller's Dome, Frank Lloyd Wright's Broadacre City, which essentially is like a lot of communities in the United States without the helicopters. So we don't have those helicopters that everyone person. These are, I believe, supposed to be nuclear-powered helicopters. And then this was Corbu's plan to destroy Paris and build these towers. Boy, I'm glad that didn't happen. But it's really fascinating when you look at the constructs that occur in science fiction, in movies, in books, and how that actually begins to create mental models for people as they imagine what the future is going to be like. It's very, very powerful. This is, of course, the Jetsons. This is a still from Star Wars when they were looking at one of the planets, what it would look like to live in the future, right? And it's always, there's a similarity across many, many genres about the type of future that people think we're destined to have and where our cities are headed. And it's very, very interesting. There's a couple different, one model that's out there is this notion of sort of there's going to be, we're all going to live in these, either these giant towers, or we're going to live in these pods, and there's, everything else is a sterile park. Not natural systems, but manicured, and really there's no street life. There's no community. So even though we've had a history of thousands of years of community that is all about interactions with place at street level, so there is now this notion that no, we have to be civilized. We have to rise above that in our motor cars and we have to exist in these tall buildings. And of course, the richer you are, the higher you're going to be in this hierarchy and that kind of thing. But everything is going to be clean and sanitary and perfect, and there is not going to be any wild bears to come along, that kind of thing. Or more common is a future like this that we see. This is stuff you've seen, right? These kinds of images. This is where a lot of people, in the back of their minds, if you ask people, well, what is the future going to be like? And they, of course, think, well, there's going to be more people, there's going to be, this is the kind of future that they envision, the sense of scale, right? That humanity has conquered the world, it's has conquered nature, and that the sky is the limit for how we can build. And in many ways, what begins to emerge, look at that, there you go, right? is this idea of not the citizen, not the resident, but of the consumer, right? And the pervasiveness of corporations that control, right, this kind of hard, and where is nature in these nature? And there is this disconnect mentally between how on earth we would, literally feed, right, and provide for a world like this, a world without nature, a world that is all about the machine, and it's a problem. But this is, I picked, go on the internet and take a look at future visions of cities and stuff. It's a bleak future for people. I don't think that's what we should accept. I think we need to start changing these visions, changing these stories to make it more possible in people's mind to imagine a future that is not more machine-like, but is in fact more about reconnecting with the natural systems that support us. And again, nature is missing. Nature is absent in all of these cityscapes. And Blade Runner, which is an incredible movie with Harrison Ford, what a dreary, I should say, future that would be. And it's not one that actually could sustain itself for more than a few decades. It would just collapse. And so what these really are is visions of a life right before a collapse, because they just are not possible. It's not possible. Right? And we are. This is Abu Dhabi, and we are in fact in many places building these kinds of communities, which I think they're an exercise in arrogance in many cases that has a shelf life of literally less lifespan than the people that are designing it. So, cities that are going to be relevant for maybe 20 more years, and they're spending billions on this construct now. And even though I think that it's really cool as a design, this to me is just shrubbing up, as a landscape friend would say, shrubbing up a paradigm. If this construct requires huge inputs of energy and is actually not very sustainable. It's a little bit better than the other construct and looks a lot more inviting because there is greenery everywhere, and he recognizes that if we are going to be building, separating ourselves from the landscape, that we need to bring some of that in the building. But there's a whole series of we're doing a lot of research into appropriate height and scale and density relative to true sustainability that is very interesting right now. So I just want to mention that. So before we get into the Living Building Challenge, and we're going to take a break, just a few things about climate change. I know that you probably know quite a bit about climate change and some of the challenges that we face. It's interesting, and I'm a Canadian. We were talking a little bit about this at dinner the other night. The Canadian economy is linked very, very tightly to the American economy, as is your economy. Right? The American economy, in my opinion, is in a whole lot of trouble from a variety of standpoints. And what they're not even thinking about, despite the great work by Al Gore and others to promote an awareness over these issues, there is a huge denial amongst many in the United States about how vulnerable their economy is to disruptions within this century. And the United States is, in fact, a coastal nation. 53% of Americans would literally be, not even the second tier of events, literally would be impacted by rising sea levels, as predicted. That's a huge impact. 53%. If you look at the major cities and the population of the U.S. Now, interesting thing about Cascadia, where I live, is the more north you get, the more the signs of climate change are becoming visible. And it's interesting, Alaska, I don't know how much you know about Alaska politics, but Alaska is a very interesting place politically. It's a very conservative place. And there's a lot of people that don't want to believe any of this stuff, even though they literally can see in front of their very eyes changes that are really scary. There's a series of villages, for example, that the Inuit and other northern peoples have lived in this area for thousands of years, and they are seeing an unprecedented rate of erosion, changes in coastal conditions, and literally there are whole villages that are dropping into the sea. And so the Alaskan government is relocating at the cost of tens of millions of dollars, relocating these villages further inland because of the scale of change. And in the Arctic, it's really scary, the impacts. In British Columbia, this is a slide that I often show because it's hard to imagine the scale of this. But BC, like Oregon, has incredible forests. And they have these great pine forests that extend, BC is huge. British Columbia, and I wish I remembered the exact, square miles of BC. But there is a forest, a contiguous forest there. It's now the size of the state of Maine, and I'm wondering how big that would be relative to some of your states. I think it's probably like, imagine the Yucatan Peninsula. The whole forest is dead and dying. The whole forest. And it's huge. And this little critter, the mountain pine bark beetle, is a scourge. And it's always been in the forest, but it needs 2 successively cold winters at certain low temperatures to check the breeding of this insect. And we have not had winters like we've had for recorded history. And so they have bred out of control. And so not only 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, and so if you fly over British Columbia, this huge area is all red trees, standing dead trees, miles and miles and miles of it, and it's climate change. It's very, very scary, and it's wreaking havoc on the British Columbia economy because of all the paper products and the wood products. It's amazing, and people are worried at what happens if they would be able to jump over the other side of the mountain, so to speak. This is the dry side, so a different ecosystem. If this kind of thing starts to happen on the wet side, where even the bigger trees and there's even more impressive forests, it would be a complete disaster. Of course, once the trees start going, they start falling, erosion starts happening, the soil starts washing into the streams, it starts killing the salmon, it starts destroying the habitat for all the other animals, etc., etc., etc. And there's a great website, 2030.org, if you haven't seen it, that shows for many cities in the United States what very modest sea level rises would look like relative to climate change in this century. Basically, New Orleans is essentially gone. So all the reconstruction efforts since Hurricane Katrina happened are for naught. And this is Boston. If you like Boston, say goodbye to Boston. And you can see, this is Seattle. And Seattle's got more topography. It's higher up than many coastal cities, but it loses its whole industrial base. This is where all the shipping for all the basically trade with China and Japan, and probably a lot from Mexico as well comes in here. Seattle. There's some great photographs of looking at sea level rises based in various cities. Of course, if you're unfortunate enough to be in a country like Bangladesh, where majority of your population lives in the direct impact zone, it is truly staggering. There's a lot of information out there. Bill McKibben, who you might know, you should try to get Bill McKibben to come, and that'd be great. He talks about this number, which of course is we've already exceeded this number. Maybe you have a more current number.
386 parts per million of CO2.
Right.
There's a scientific consensus that at 500 we've lost it.
We've lost
it. Almost impossible for the human race to
That's right.
revert. So we're at 386. It has never been above 300 in 800,000 years.
That's right. And this is a number, and we don't know if this is right, but this is the number above which we shouldn't go if we want to avoid some of the more catastrophic impacts, and we've already exceeded it. And what I'm hearing is 400 is a certainty now. We're going to be at 400.
If we keep business as usual,
right,
we will reach 1,200 in the year 2050. That's where we're going.
So this is a wake-up call. And of course, it isn't just that issue. There's so many ways that we need to be awake to. We are literally poisoning ourselves. And I'm going to get into some of this with the Living Building Challenge. It's really sad when you look at mercury in seafood, where there's so much seafood that is unsafe for us to eat. And literally, just like we're heading to a place where in not too long we will not be able to eat any seafood. That will be gone from our palate completely. Now think about the cultures around the world that depend upon it, and it will be that toxic for every fish. That's where we're headed right now. Right? And peak water, many people are worried as much about peak water, which again, climate change is a huge player in these trends. But look at this chart looks at water resources around the world. And the trend in Mexico is obviously not heading in the right direction. It's not heading in the right direction in the United States. Canada is luckier because it has so much water. But the U.S. is going to take our water when they get far enough along. It's pretty interesting how much water we use. This is a great graphic of how much water we use to make a few things that we need. It's crazy. Look at the burger. Right? So we have to, and this is part two, the real part two of this discussion. Let's take a short break. Is how we can really change what we value, right? And we're going to, when we come back, talk about the ecological paradigm.